Momento, quindi poi 4 parole in inglese le dico, ma insomma. Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming, but I apologize, I will speak Italian for now, and then they all have headphones, so we will translate whatever. Allora, adesso riparlo italiano, e grazie mille per essere qua, e per noi è non solo un onore, ma un grandissimo piacere riaccogliere il nostro amico Ali Cherri. Ha cominciato a donarci le sue meraviglie in quella mostra che facemmo nel lontano 2018, Anche le statue muoiono. C'era un'opera di Ali esposta e poi il video che facemmo allora, e tutto questo noi lo conserviamo nelle nostre memorie e nelle nostre cose più belle. Ovviamente il discorso è complicato, loro sanno più di me come raccontarvelo, no? Queste deportazioni, queste spoliazioni, queste deprivazioni che molti paesi hanno conosciuto sia per il colonialismo ma anche no, perché in fondo qualunque opera d'arte, qualunque reperto, qualunque pezzo si voglia trasportare o deportare, ditelo come volete, dal suo luogo originario, di fatto viene spogliato della sua radice, del suo contesto, della sua origine, ed è un discorso molto interessante anche per quanto riguarda le grandi opere di restauro. Pensate per esempio alla grande polemica che ancora sentiamo per esempio riguardo ai Moai in Nuova Zelanda, cioè non in Nuova Zelanda, all'isola di Pasqua, e lì bisognava tirarli su, non bisognava tirarli su, le pietre erano giù, bisognava non mettere su, insomma è un discorso che non finisce mai. Ali ci presenta il suo libro questa sera e poi, posso dirlo, lo portiamo a sentire un grande italiano, Riccardo Muti, e quindi è un grande onore avere lui e avere Riccardo Muti stasera a Torino. Grazie. Passo a Cristian.
Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti. Faccio anch'io 2 parole e le faccio però in inglese, tanto c'è la possibilità di traduzione per chi vorrà, ma così anche Ali capisce quello che gli voglio dire. So Ali, it's a great honor and pleasure to have you back. Personally, I think you made a miracle because before I met you, I thought that art died with Seti I or with Ramses II. And there is an ongoing discussion with my team whether we should implement contemporary art or nothing. But then I met you when you, as Evelina remembered, you came here in 2018. Your work, which is so linked to Egypt, it's so linked to archaeology, really started a reflection within our museum about what is a museum, what is archaeology, what are we doing. Your video on how is archaeology destroying a context, how is archaeology the rest, so those who are sleeping or wish to have an eternal rest, and what are the ethical implications of a collection like ours. You were, and we are very glad that you were the artist that accompanied us for our bicentennial, and we all had together the pleasure and the honor to meet the President of the Republic. But what you did, returning the gaze, was how do we deal with a work of art that that went through damnatio memoriae? How can we give back the gaze, and how this giving back the gaze put us in a different relation? So we are very glad that you're here. We are very glad that we managed to publish the book about your work, and I hope that this is a returning friendship, that our path will meet again very soon, and that together we can also discuss, because we are now approaching, we hope, the end of our building process, and then your work of art would be in our piazza, and we should discuss together how to exhibit it, but also how to keep reflecting about what is a museum, because I think that now more than ever we need to think about heritage, contested heritage in places of war, and how this is our memory that we need to safeguard. So thank you for being here. Thank you.
Just a word, thank you to the President, to the Director, I feel I'm coming back to a family here. I mean, seeing so many familiar faces, people I worked with for a year. So I'm extremely happy to be back. I feel I'm back to my family here. So thank you for your welcome. And so I'm gonna start with a small excerpt of a film before starting the talk. Maybe if we can turn off the lights.
de lait, de lait, de lait.
Film made in 1932, which opens with a poet alone in his studio, drawing a face. As he sketches the mouth, the drawing suddenly comes alive. Alarmed, he tries to erase it with his hand, but the mouth transfers onto his palm, still breathing and still speaking. He attempts to wash it away, to suffocate it, to get rid of it. Yet the more he resists, the more this fragment of his own creation clings to him. The scene inaugurates the film's first chapter, sometimes described as the wounded hand or the scar of the poet, and its stage is a simple but disturbing idea. Once summoned, artistic creation refused to remain an image. It becomes autonomous, invasive, and forced the artist deeper into his own interior world. Cocteau conceived the film as a descent into the mechanism of imagination, a journey not through narrative, but through the artist's own subconscious, where images detach from intention and begin to act on their own. In this opening moment, creation is not shown as inspiration or mastery, but as a contamination. The artist does not produce the image captures the artist. The mouth becomes a wound, a living fragment, a displaced organ that must be relocated on a statue, which will then awaken and send him through the mirror into the labyrinths of his own mind. I wanted to start here because this strange gesture, drawing a mouth that refuses to stay on the surface, may be one of the most powerful metaphors in cinema for what happens when images stop being representation and begin to behave like bodies. So I'm here today to speak about the project I developed in dialogue with the Egyptian Museum here in Torino, and more broadly about how my work approaches museums, not simply as places that contains objects, but as machines that produce ways of seeing. My practice moves between film, sculpture, installation, and drawing, but across the forms I return repeatedly to the same question. What happens to objects, bodies, and histories when they enter institutional system of preservation, classification, and display? I am not interested in the object itself, rather in the condition that makes them visible. The museum is one of the places where the accumulation of violence, memory, and ideology become most visible, forming layers of meaning. It gathers objects from different centuries, territories, belief systems, and compresses them into a single spatial sequence. Walking through a museum can feel like moving through a geological cut in time. You pass from one historical layer to another, not chronologically as lived experience unfolds, but spatially through architecture, vitrine, lighting, and curatorial decisions. It is like multiple tectonic plates press against each other. In that sense, the museum is not simply a place that stores objects, it's a device that transforms silent traces into historical discourse, deciding how the past becomes legible to the present. When I first started working here at the Egyptian Museum, one of the things that struck me the most was the presence of the eyes. Many Egyptian statues were originally designed so that their gaze would confront the living. There were no neutral sculptural feature, but active elements meant to establish presence, authority, or spiritual continuity. Yet today in the museum, many of these eyes are damaged, erased, or missing. They cannot return our gaze. A strong asymmetry emerges. We look at them, but they cannot look back. The object becomes visible, but its original capacity to see, to address, or to intervene has been neutralized. This condition made me think about museum objects as existing in a suspended state. They are not alive, but they are not entirely dead either. They are preserved, stabilized, immobilized, yet still carrying within them dense layers of ritual, political power, cultural transformation, and historical displacement. They resemble geological formation more than artworks. They are deposits of time. Working inside the Egyptian Museum intensified this understanding. The museum is an extraordinary archive, but it's also a space where multiple temporal times collide. There is the ritual time of the ancient object, the colonial time of 19th century archaeology, the scientific time of classification and conservation, and the contemporary time of tourism and spectatorship. These layers do not replace one another, they coexist. It is less like a single historical narrative and more like a tectonic plate pressing against each other. The visitor is also part of the structure. We often imagine that we are simply observing the museum, but in reality, the museum is simultaneously producing us as viewers. Architecture directs our movement, labels guide interpretation, and glass vitrine establish distance. Lighting isolates certain surfaces while hiding others, and surveillance systems regulate behavior. The museum is not showing objects, it's producing a choreography of perception. So for my project at the museum here, I wanted to produce a series of prosthetic eyes cast in bronze. Bronze interested me because it belongs to both ancient sculptural tradition and contemporary casting. They were not reconstruction of the original eyes. They were prosthetic elements, additions that acknowledge loss rather than erasing it. The act of placing these elements to make the photographic document became almost ritualistic. Inevitably, it made me think of the ancient Egyptian opening of the mouth ceremony, where the statue or mummy was symbolically reactivated so it could breathe, speak, and see again in the afterlife. Of course, I was not trying to reproduce the ritual, but there was a strange echo in the gesture of physically placing the bronze mask onto these bodies. Even when given the poetic possibility to see again through these prosthetic bronze eyes, many of the figures kept their eyes closed. It was as if the act of restoring vision did not necessarily produce awakening. Instead, it produced more ambiguous state, somewhere between sleep, death, resistance, and refusal. For me, this moment revealed something essential. The museum can stabilize objects so they survive time, but survival does not automatically mean return to life. Presence cannot simply be restored. Visibility cannot be mechanically repaired. The figures stood there, equipped with the possibility of vision, and yet still withdrawn within themselves. This reinforced the idea that the museum is not a place where objects return to life, it's a place where they remain suspended. Not alive, not gone, but stabilized, waiting. Another project that helped crystallize this question about museums, visibility, and the life of images was my residency at the National Gallery in London in 2022. Rather than studying the painting only through iconography, I became interested in moments when violence had physically entered the museum space. While researching the archive of the National Museum, I discovered incidents in which paintings has been attacked by visitors, slashed, shot, sprayed, or otherwise damaged while on display. Newspapers spoke of the painting as if they were living bodies. The cuts were described as wounds. The conservators were described as surgeons. There was a collective urgency to repair the image and above all to erase the traces of violence. This revealed something fundamental about the museum. We tend to think of the museum as a space that preserves history, but there are also spaces that regulate what forms of trauma remains visible and what must disappear. For the exhibition, If You Prick Us, Do We Not Bleed at the National Gallery, I translated 5 vandalized paintings into sculptural assemblage placed inside the museum, like vitrine. Instead of reconstructing the original image, I imagined what happens after the wound, how violence transforms the artwork from something unstable, almost monstrous, never entirely restored. In that sense, the museum appears not only as guardian of objects, but also as a manager of scars. Museums also produce a particular atmosphere, a controlled calm that can feel almost sacred. Silence, filtered light, stable temperature, carefully regulated circulation. Time appears to stop. But this stillness is manufactured. And when time appears to freeze, history does not disappear, it accumulates. Like sediments, like ruins piling up slowly. These are more views of the exhibition at the National Gallery. I want to show now a small excerpt of a film called Somniculus, which is Latin for night sleep, a film shot in Paris in 5 museums, at the Louvre, Quai Branly, the Musée de l'Homme, the Man Museum, the Natural History Museum, and the Hunting Museum. If we can turn off the lights, please. Mention about the National Gallery project was something, a remark that the director of the National Gallery made during the opening of the exhibition. So the project started with the Rokeby Venus, the Velázquez painting that was slashed by the suffragette in 1917. And so the director said that the restoration that was done back then on the wounds, on the scars that were done on Velázquez painting, after 100 years started to age differently. So all of a sudden these wounds that they managed to erase, or at least to make them disappear, start to resurface again. And I found it like a very beautiful metaphor of this, like 100 years later, where these scars is like the return of the suppressed that comes to the surface. Okay. So to go back to what interests me across many of my works is the recurrent figure of the guard. Like here we saw a museum guard. Long before the soldier became central in my films, the guard was already present in different forms. The archaeological guard in the digger, the worker embedded in the infrastructure of the state in the dam, the museum guard in Somniculus, and later the young conscript in the watchman and the sentinel. In each case, the figure is less defined by action than by position. The guard is someone who waits, watches, maintains a boundary, or protects something whose meaning may not even be clear to him. The soldier is therefore not a new subject in my work, but an intensification of this earlier figure. The soldier is therefore not a new subject in my work, The soldier is therefore a guard pushed to an extreme condition where surveillance becomes permanent, where the body itself becomes part of the border, and where waiting becomes a form of life. This idea of accumulated time, of suspending vigilance, and of bodies caught inside a larger historical structure also connects to my work beyond the museum context. What interests me in this figure is not the spectacle of the combat, but the temporal condition of waiting, of surveillance, exhaustion, and psychological tension. The soldier often exists in a state of prolonged anticipation, trained to remain alert even when nothing happens. This produces a very particular relationship to time, to space, and to the body itself. It's a condition that is both political and deeply intimate. And of course, the parallel between the guard or the soldier and the role of the museum are very, there's a lot of permeability between these two conditions. I'm gonna show two small excerpts of two soldier films, The Watchman and The Sentinel. The Sentinel is a film I just finished earlier this year. So it's two small excerpts from these films, and then I'll continue about the soldier.
Akıncılarda tüm nöbet yerleri, gece vardiyası sonu için hazır ol. Bulut Çavuş, anlaşıldı mı?
Yok, yok buradayım.
Follows the daily routine of Sergeant Bullet, whose task is to watch a horizon, a border that is not physically visible, a territory with a long history of violence. And I was interested in this condition of witness, of when we bear witness to history of violence, and how bearing witness can sometimes exhaust our vision, and through this losing the ability even to be able to see. So again, I mean, the theme of the gaze comes back here in a different context. The next excerpt is from the film about, so it's part of a trilogy I'm building around the figure of the soldier. This time it's a French soldier on the 14th of July in a French military base in northern France. Excerpt missing. I'll continue. The idea, in this sense, whether I'm working with ancient artifacts, geological materials, or contemporary military figures, the underlying question remains similar. I'm interested in how systems of power inscribe themselves into matter, into landscape, and into perception. I'm interested in how visibility itself is constructed, regulated, and stabilized. I'm interested in moments where this apparent stability begins to crack, where objects, bodies, or images reveal the pressure that formed them. The project in Torino was therefore not about interpreting Egyptian history in a traditional academic sense. It was about making visible the structure through which history itself becomes visible. Because what ultimately fascinates me is not only what we see, but the conditions that make seeing possible. The museum in this sense is not simply a container of objects, it is a landscape of accumulated gazes, accumulated narrative, and accumulated time. The project in Torino was therefore not about, in parallel, I'm currently working with Lina Gotme Architecture on the British Museum Western Range redevelopment, focusing on the redisplay and museography of the collection. So this was a competition that was launched by the British Museum to rethink 1/3 of the British Museum. It's going to be the biggest renovation that ever happened in the history of the museum. So the architectural team that won the project, Lina Gotme Architects, I was one of the members, at least I'm a consultant on this project, and will be working closely with the architectural team. This collaboration is unfolding at a moment when the museum is visibly revealed as a site of contested language. Very recently, I'm not sure if you heard about the recent controversy, the British Museum faced public criticism after changing a small number of labels and maps where the term Palestine has been used in ways the institution now considers, in some context, historically unclear or politically charged, replacing it with other terms depending on period and region. The museum states this review began well before the public controversy, while critics argue the change risks participating in erasure. For me, this debate doesn't sit outside the museum. It sits at its core. It shows in real time how the museum is not only a place where history is displayed, but a place where the conditions of historical visibility are negotiated, revised, and fought over, and sometimes through a simple word. So if I return to the beginning, for me, archaeology is not about excavation. It is about exposure. Not only exposing the past, but exposing systems that decide how the past becomes visible. Museums are not cemeteries of objects. They are theaters of historical power. And perhaps the role of artists in these spaces is not to decorate them, nor simply to critique them from outside, but to slightly disturb their optics, to introduce small displacements, to create moments where objects seem to look back at us, where visibility itself becomes unstable. Because the question is not only what we see in museums, the question is also what remains unseen in the act of seeing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being so thought-provoking. And as always, when we look at your art, when we discuss with you, it's impossible not to be touched and moved and to question our role as museum. So I have a question for you, which is almost impossible to answer, but I would like to see what is your point of view. Given, as you said, that a museum is an accumulation of gazes, is also a power structure, and we know that the modern museum is born thanks to Enlightenment, is born during imperialism and colonialism, and gives a certain history of the past. Evelina Lai and I wrote a small book a few years ago, thinking about what is the past? Does the past exist or not? Well, the past that we see in museums is not the real past. I mean, what ancient Egypt was, who knows? But it was sure not we given the museum.
And we do have that painting in the book.
Yeah. We
really?
talked about the
Okay.
Velasquez. Yes.
Interesting.
In your idea, what could we do to try to transform the museum? And I try to define more my questions. Given that the museum is a structure of power, given that its roots are in Enlightenment and positivism, in a Eurocentric moment, is it possible to decolonize the museum? Talking about the British Museum, is it enough to get a Hans loan and to put it aside and then to say, well, it's not the colonized museum? In other words, what is your view of the future of the museum? And that goes together because you're really thought-provoking. I mean, one of the works that for me still reminds so incredibly, and I look it back very often, is your view on archaeology. What are the archaeologists doing? Why are we disturbing? And is there a solution in your view? And what is, and as if I was talking with the director of the V&A, Tristan Hunt, who said, well, we shouldn't use the word Enlightenment anymore because it's so semantically charged. But then my question was, what should we use instead? Which is, because we can destroy, but how can we reconstruct? It's very difficult indeed.
Yeah. If I had, yes, I mean, I think this is, I mean, I'd be pretentious to even try to start replying to this question, because this is, I mean, the big debate today. And I think most these new museum projects are trying to tackle and face, like, what is the image of what kind of museum do we imagine for
if
the
you want,
future?
we can confine it to a more defined things. I was talking to a colleague, she's a cultural anthropologist, and she was saying the shortcut that museums are taking is very easy, in the sense they bring contemporary art inside to question their role, as if in doing that they're washing their souls. But are we going really to the core?
I mean, for me, I mean, we had the discussion like at the end of the residency, and I still think, I mean, there's a first, me being here, museums trying to look for contemporary artists to make their collection still relevant is first of all to admit of a failure of their project. If they did not manage to remain relevant and they need contemporary artists to still talk to the society and be relevant to society, then there's a failure in the vision of of their role as custodian of this history. So we can start from here. That's, at least if it's not a failure, it's a crisis. We have a crisis today of collecting of the museum. For me, I mean, I'm talking really from a position as an artist. For me, the museum is still very relevant and still very important. But the main role, as I see it today, is the museum is a place where we come together as a society, and where we could dream together, we could imagine together, we can open to other possible political realities of how to be together. For me, all these objects that are the museum are an excuse for us to be, you know, like, to enter a building and start dreaming about, you know, our history and our future. So the main role is let's say, building a community, like building, imagining like an ideal society and working towards that. And especially today, at a moment of crisis, when society is divided, when violence, you know, I mean, is really back, the rise of fascism, you know, like very violent, you know, like schism in the society. The museums can play this role of bridging this political tension into more humanist, let's say, perspective about how we are together. That's what's interesting. I mean, honestly, like, we don't care if, like, this mummy is 3,000 or 4,000, 5,000 years old. What matters is how this speak to us, speak to our humanity, make us nicer to each other, make us want to, you know, like, open up to different culture, want to be curious about other cultures. So the role of these, especially historical museum, is a very contemporary role. And I think you know this very well, and I think you are, you know, like, one of the, I mean, the institution here is really conscious about the contemporary role that it has in Italy, in Torino, and what does it mean to have an Egyptian museum here today? I mean, and should be the top question. It's not about history, it's about the present political moment.
I couldn't agree more. I would have a lot of other questions, but I would like to give the chance to everybody to ask questions. So, ci sono domande, curiosità, volete approfittare della presenza di Ali per discutere su questi temi che ci toccano tutti. Yes, Vilek.
Yes, of course.
Thank you so much for all your work, for your thought-provoking words. To me, as an archaeologist and as an Egyptologist, what really touches me is the fact that sometimes I can touch the past. So there are moments where I look at how things were made, the thought, the care that went into craftsmanship, for instance. And whenever someone asks me what is the most beautiful thing you ever found as an archaeologist, my answer is it's a brush that was very much worn down, and it was made of rope and palm fiber, and I could put my hands on the sweaty pattern of someone who wielded this brush for decades, and now after millennia, I can almost touch the past. And I think this deep humanity is something that is visible in this museum in particular.
This is very beautiful, thank you. And I mean, and it's about, I think, the creative gesture that we could all relate to, and that's why I wanted to open with the excerpt from Cocteau film, because it's about that. It's when the artist, the creative gesture happen, and then it just sticks to you, and you have to give it to, to spread it as contamination. So I see this brush maybe has contaminated you, and it's in the love and maybe attention that was put in it.
No, I was thinking about the problem of decolonizing the museum, and I realized that the problem is the frames. So most of the collection are framed as a cultural eye of the past. So I was thinking that an attempt to eliminate this problem is maybe the one that was made in Louvre, Abu Dhabi, in which they try to eliminate the borders of a culture, a population, and try to make a mix. So this is much more from the roots than from the outside, like contemporary art can make a reflection on the wrong collection, wrong in terms of the contemporary, but doesn't change. So do you think that this will be the direction of the future of contemporary archaeology or anthropologist museum? Because we have in Turin also a small collection of anthropology that is hidden, totally hidden. That is another question.
I mean, this is part of, that's emerged out of this crisis that I started talking about, and museums are trying to think outside the box, let's say, try to imagine. I mean, we see also now a big trend of museums of what is on display is the storage. The storage becomes the exhibition space, and you can just, visitors can roam through the storage of the museum as also a possibility of maybe loosening a bit the authority of the institution as being the one that produce historical narrative and as authority that produce truth, and leave some space for people to create their own stories. I mean, I still think that going towards these other forms, I still think the museum itself, I mean, the tradition of the museum, I mean, if you want to go back to the museum that was born from the project of enlightenment, it's still a project that can work, but we still didn't find the formula, in my opinion. I mean, these attempts of course of putting together objects from different time geographies, and thinking about like a different way of looking at these objects is maybe a way of doing it, but I think these objects, these displays are self-sufficient. I mean, they didn't need rescue, neither from a contemporary artist, neither from contemporary objects. They are still, if we give them the right attention and receptivity, if we allow them to have their own space and an existence, they are sufficient to speak to us. I mean, I feel we don't need to all these gimmicks in order to make them relevant.
If I might comment as well on Abu Dhabi, you were talking, Ali, about construction of power, and the fact that a new museum in Seoul is built there is a certain power structure, which is due to money, to possibilities. So the way where museums are constructed is the same. It's true, you say, that they try not to have boundaries between chronology and different religions, for instance. So at first glance, at first sight, when you see a Torah, a Bible, and a Quran, it's beautiful, but it tends sometimes to oversimplify, in the sense that it tends to give, and there is a political idea behind, there is Abrahamic family house behind it, to say we are all brother, we are all children of Abraham, so we are all living together in harmony, which unfortunately we know is not true. And so sometimes the complexity of reality is really, but as you say, to try to find a way, and the example that Willeke gave, to let the object talk by itself without over construction, over categories, is sometimes very difficult.
And maybe, sorry, I just want to say one thing, and maybe it's also asked the question about the Universal Museum. I mean, this is like a form of a vision of a Universal Museum. And when we see this Universal Museum exists next door to Sheikh Zayed Museum, the National Museum that's opened recently, which has a very nationalist, even, like excluding, like certain, like minority histories that built, the country and the Gulf region. So how could like a universalist project exist next door to a super nationalist project? So then you could speak, maybe it makes it more. Yeah.
Should take this point.
Yeah.
Now,
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And also near the Guggenheim, so that's also would be very interesting what kind of programming contemporary art will have in the region. And we have, of course, in Riyadh, the World Cultures Museum. So talking about structures of powers, it's very interesting anyway that now the Arabic Peninsula is one of the places where museums are flourishing, and in Europe we are cutting down and we're closing, but there is still power, involved, and money.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yes. It's also, you said something very interesting about the displacement of objects. But then you said also that the museum remains a very nice place where you can encounter the other, or people from other places. And I'm reading, because it came out last week, the last book of Benedict Savoy about 1815 and the first coming back of collections after Napoleon within Europe, and how this has moved a process that of thinking about the legitimacy of ownership of objects. But we still have a problem that we don't tackle. We still have a divide between global north and global south in terms of circulation of art. So how people in the African continent can encounter the other, very little. I think that's also a major problem. Besides restitution, is what the cultural production that we have in a certain part of the world doesn't meet some other parts of the world, so some people are not exposed.
Yeah. Now working at the British Museum, the British Museum has so many layers of, problematic, histories, and all the way to very recent history. So it's very interesting, because I'm also an observer. Of course, the project is first of all an architectural project. So I'm like a parasite. I'm like getting information. So it was interesting first to see what the museum assignment was. What the museum, what they asked the architects to present as a project, so what the museum proposal was, how architects respond, because I followed, the whole selection process, and I was, I saw the other proposal from different architectural firms, and why they chose this specific project, and all the way to the questions that are rising today, because it's gonna be, one of the tasks of the renovation of the architecture firm is also the display of the objects, and creating labels, and it goes all the way to the architecture project, but also to creating the narrative inside this new architectural space. And you know how much this today is gonna be like a very hot topic, and very, there's power, there's like pressure, a lot of pressure on the museum, who's gonna own the narrative, which story is gonna be told. And for me, it's like high hope of thinking we will arrive to museums that are, like a peaceful place where we come together to be with, to be at peace with each other. And I think more they're gonna be sites of conflict. And sadly, instead of being a place that's gonna repair society, they're gonna be places that are gonna mirror the outside conflicts inside.
Is there another question? Maybe we have time for another questions? Well, last one, yes.
First, thank you. It's been fascinating. I wish to ask a question from not the museum point of view, more an artistic point of view. Something observing about your role, which is compelling, how you're very subversive, right? You even here at the Museo Egizio, you put a lot of thorns, and it's really welcomed by the institution. I think here in Torino we have a very enlightened, to use the word enlightenment, institution. So I'm very curious about this role you have as an artist who's subversive, but whose proposals are welcomed and also sought after by a lot of institutions. Do you ever find yourself on the other side where, in a way, either there's resistance or you're really stepping on people's toes, or there's some kind of conflict as an artist? I'm curious from this point of view.
Yeah, I agree. I have to say, at no point and at any point of discussion with the team, with the director, with the president, there was any they tried to change my mind or things, or not let me do something. And that's really, I appreciate that a lot. I think it's because also I'm not trying to be provocative. I'm trying to think about the structure of, usually the invitation create work in dialogue with the collection, something nice we could display. And I'm always trying to subvert this invitation and not think about the collection, but think about the institution that hosts the collection. That happened with the National Gallery. There was a lot of resistance in the beginning, for instance, because the National Gallery, that was the topic that I didn't want to talk about, is about vandalism. And they didn't want to talk about, paintings that were vandalized. And there are even paintings that I discovered in the archives that they were never made public, that they were vandalized, although this is a public collection, so a bit problematic. And one thing interesting, after the opening of my show, the director mentioned that there was a few years back, I don't know if you remember, at the Tate Modern, an exhibition called Iconoclash, and they asked to borrow the Rockaby Venus as part of looking at violence, I guess. The destruction of icons. And the museum at the time refused, because they didn't want their work, the painting, to be framed in this, framework about, violence and about violence. And the director said that today I regret that I refused to accept lending this art. Trying to resist the reality of what happens after violence and the role of the institution as the caretakers. Because, of course, when a painting is vandalized, this is a failure for the institution or the caretaker. They should protect these work. Any work that is breaks or whatever is a failure as custodian of this work. So I think because I'm trying to think with the institution, I hope. I'm trying to open a dialogue. I don't think I'm trying to, like denounce. I don't think we should destroy museums, and I don't think museums are relevant, because I really believe so. I mean, it's not a posture. So yeah, maybe it's, but sometimes also the margins, I mean, I'm seeing this at the British Museum, like every day I'm thinking, am I just there as a, like to also validate certain decisions, and how much margin of action what can I change actually at an institution like the British Museum? So I've thought several times of withdrawing from the project. We'll see who will win at the end, if I stay or, I mean, if at some point I feel I'm not doing anything and I'm just a name that they validate things, I prefer to withdraw.
It's just my point of view. I think your contribution whatsoever would be very important. So I hope that you fight through and you find your way to have your voice heard, because I think would be very important. But I would like to thank you for coming here and saying that if you have a little bit of spare time, even though your task at the British Museum is enormous, you're always welcome here, and there are still many things that we need to tackle, and I hope that our dialogue will continue in the years to come and help us guide and see how we can find new ways to look at the past. So thank you so much for coming.